Just in the past 2 years, Roe v. Wade was overturned, a landmark abortion ruling from 1973. EPA rights have been scaled back, leaving environmentalists concerned for the future. And most recently, a haunting ruling on presidential immunity from the Supreme Court. It is very clear that we are dealing with an ultra conservative Supreme Court that is basically unstoppable with a small liberal majority. There have been calls for term limits, investigations into corruption of the justices who reside on the bench, and even impeachment. But what does this mean for us, and is there an actual plan to bring forth practical reform for the highest court in the country? Joining me now for the interview is Attorney Steven Gregory of the Gregory Law Firm. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate it. I think I'm going to enjoy it.
Can you explain to me how, I guess, sort of packing the federal courts and the Supreme Court turned out to be a smart logistical move?
Well, that turned out to be a smart logistical move by the Trump administration, if that's what you're referring to.
Mhm.
Donald Trump got the opportunity to appoint more Supreme Court justices than many presidents. As you probably know, there have been presidents who did not get the opportunity to appoint a single justice. Trump appointed three. And so now the court, as you know, um, has a supermajority of conservative justices.
Mhm.
And, and I would say that within those conservative justices and within that 6-member conservative bloc, you have some who are sort of moderately right and some who are definitely hard right. And but not only has the did the Trump administration appoint those justices, but the Trump administration also was able to appoint a large number of justices to the circuit courts, which
Mm.
as you know, are the intermediate courts of appeal
Mhm.
in the federal system. And if I'm not mistaken, Donald Trump also has appointed more circuit court judges than any other president. And so uh, President Biden has appointed a large number of federal judges too, but most of the ones he's appointed have been trial court
Mm.
judges, district court judges.
You talk about in your piece here in terms of solutions for the court, issues that I guess many of us sort of, if you look at it through the views of mainstream, have not sort of looked into, but you talk about the court's lack of diversity, that justices are out of touch, little experience in government, and essentially connected to places with high power. You say here, quote, moreover, no justice has any background whatsoever in science or technology or in engineering. Their undergraduate majors are political science, history, English, government, philosophy, and public and international affairs. To be harsh, no sitting justice can claim any direct familiarity with the most significant intellectual achievements of the past 200 years. Their 18th century educations at elitist schools have not prepared the members of the court for their duties in the 21st century. This lack of intellectual diversity, indeed, this lack of mental scope on the court, cannot be healthy for the court or for the country. I wanted to ask you about that specific part of your piece there because it's interesting to me. Do you think, I guess, if you contrast the Roberts Court with, I guess, the Earl Warren Court and how that court was more so for the people than our current court is are the justices being out of touch with reality and sort of, I guess, viewed as above us? Does that affect how they rule in our society?
I do think it affects how they perceive themselves and
Mm.
their role in government and their role in society. I do think they have become more and more a sort of ivory tower entity in government. And I think they are less and less responsive to not only the needs and the issues that interest people, uh, but also out of touch and not responsive to issues in law that really ought to be resolved by the Supreme Court. But instead, in recent years, the Supreme Court, as you know well, has focused on social and cultural and political issues, perhaps to the exclusion of sort of hard law, which it seems to me is what our courts need to be doing. As you know, one of the duties of the Supreme Court is to, for example, resolve splits among the circuits. The 11th Circuit views a statute in one particular way, the Ninth Circuit may view it in another way. I don't think they do enough of that. And I don't think they do enough of clarification of existing law. But to go back and respond to the sort of broader sweep of what you were talking about, or the quotation you read, I'm really not the only person who's made these kinds of comments about the Supreme Court. And as you know, and other elsewhere in the piece, this Supreme Court is really just a Northeastern colloquium of
Mhm.
people who graduated from two law schools, Harvard and Yale. Now we now have one graduate of the Notre Dame Law School, but 8 of the 9 justices graduated from either Harvard or Yale, and that actually has been the case. It has been the case in recent hailed from one of those institutions. Surely we produce good lawyers in other law schools. Surely we produce judicial candidates in other law schools. And I don't think it's so critically important that a justice have an engineering background or a biology background or a physics background specifically for the purpose of ruling on cases. But I do think it would be useful for the Supreme Court to have a more varied intellectual background than they have. As you read in that piece that I wrote, they're really all humanities majors. And they are humanities majors and who all went to the same schools. So they see each other as, I think, they see each other as a sort of club. And they pretend, and we look at them and we think, oh, they have, they're diverse, but I think they have more of a superficial diversity. And I think they think of themselves as more friendly with each other than with the rest of the world.
Wow. You wrote in your proposal that court packing is not the answer. Term limits are a fantasy, and you actually call for something that I'm not sure I've heard of before, but I did wake up early to reread it. Can you explain your proposal in layman's terms? Because I'm very interested in it.
I appreciate it. You probably haven't heard of it before. Plus, there's a lot to unpack, as it were, here with all of these issues. Court packing, of course, is a term that came about in Franklin Roosevelt's administration when he sought to add more justices to the court in order to get the New Deal passed. As it turned out, he didn't really have to do that because the New Deal legislation ultimately was reviewed favorably by the Supreme Court anyway. But it typically refers to, and I think President Biden has made some proposals about this, to adding a few justices, maybe 4 more justices to the Supreme Court so that you would have 13 instead of 9. I think that that argument to add a few justices really is just a sort of, and it's pretty transparent really, excuse for a particular president to add more justices from sort of his side of the fence. And I think we need a much broader reform than that. Think about it. 9 justices is not set in stone. Originally, the Supreme Court had 6. At some point, it had 7 justices. And now, of course, it has 9. I'm really not sure why anybody thought 6 justices would work since you don't have a tiebreaker, but somehow they survived with 6 for a while. But if you think about it, when the Supreme Court was new and it had 6 justices, the United States had what, 13 million people? And now we have 300 million people. And if you just compare the size of the court in that sense. Obviously, it seems a little small today.
Mm,
And I'm getting around to the specifics of my proposal, but you know, I always think about this when I talk to people about the Supreme Court. I ask them to think about this. When a Supreme Court justice is driving into work in the morning uh, from Virginia or from the district or from Maryland or wherever that particular justice lives, what is he or she thinking about? What do I have to do today? Well, they issue only about 80 or 90 opinions every year. And so actually writing opinions is not really the bulk of the court's work, I think,
mm,
because while they issue 80 or 90 opinions a year, you know this, they receive about 10,000 petitions for writ of certiorari. They get about 10,000 requests to review a case.
wow.
They have to look at them, you know, somebody has to look at all of those. And now it's true that clerks do a lot of that preliminary work, obviously. But it seems to me that with only 9 justices, with 300 million Americans, with large numbers of petitions for writ of certiorari every year, maybe they need more people. But another reason I think they need more people, and not just 13, is that I think the way we have structured the court today and the way the media obsess over opinions, the way the media obsess over each individual justice and what his or her background is and what he may be thinking about a particular case and so on, this
Hmm.
leads to some of the kinds of corruption issues that we've seen.
Hmm.
Because then Harlan Crow can take one of the justices on the court on lengthy vacations that would cost millions of dollars if he had to pay for it, and it just doesn't look, you know, the optics of that are just not ideal. So it seems to me that if we had not 9, not 13, but lots more justices, then we would not focus so much on each individual justice. And it would not be possible for a corporate interest or a billionaire to sway the views of a particular justice by providing favors to him or her. So my proposal, to get to that, is to restructure the federal circuit courts so that we have, instead of the present 12 circuit courts plus the DC circuit, and we would have 15 circuit courts. The Ninth Circuit, which is, of course, on the West Coast, is way too large. It's by far the largest circuit in terms of the number of justices. You could easily justify making the Ninth Circuit just California and dividing it, the other states that it now covers, and putting them into new circuits. So that ultimately, and that's been considered, there's actually a bill pending before Congress right now to divide up the Ninth Circuit, because everybody, I think, a lot of people realize it's too large. But so my proposal would have 15 circuit courts. And then the president could nominate 3 justices from each of those circuit courts to serve on the Supreme Court.
Mm,
And they would serve on the Supreme Court in rotating panels. I think this would get around the issue of term limits. Term limits sound great, but and you read about them in the media all the time. But as you know, the Constitution in Article 3 says that that federal judges serve during good behavior,
hmm.
which the courts have interpreted to mean, well, that's for life. And it's hard to argue that it doesn't mean. And so I think term limits, if you just try to pass a bill limiting the terms of Supreme Court justices or other federal judges, it's unconstitutional.
Mm,
So you'd have to pass a constitutional amendment, and that's almost impossible, I think. But it's not impossible to restructure the court in the way that I'm talking about, because the Congress has the authority to do it. That's in, the authority is in Article 3 for Congress to arrange for courts to exist as the Congress chooses. That's how we've had various numbers of Supreme Court justices. It's how we've changed the number of circuit courts. So that would be my proposal. It would, I think, drastically reduce the focus on each individual member of the court, but it would also mean that for any particular case, it wouldn't be so obvious which justices would be sitting on that case. Just in the circuit courts today, as you know, all the circuit courts actually work in panels. So if I have a case pending before the 11th Circuit, which is the circuit court for my part of the country, I know that I'm going to get a panel of 3 judges, actually, not all the judges on the court. And I don't know which 3 it will be when I file that appeal. That would be the case under my proposal for the Supreme Court. So, and I hate to use this term, but that would mean that that buying or influencing judges really wouldn't work, because you'd never know which judges would sit on a particular case.
Once again, this is a proposal by Attorney Steven Gregory in terms of reforming the Supreme Court. Thank you so much for coming on the show. I appreciate it again.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed it.